Welcome to the EURACTIV Disinformation series. Today I have a great pleasure of introducing Nina Jankowicz, Disinformation Fellow at Wilson Center, a Washington, D.C. based think tank. Hello to you, Nina.
Dzień dobry. Hi, nice to see you.
Dzień dobry. How's life in D.C. nowadays?
Well, it's been a little bit of a difficult couple of months here in Washington. Obviously, with the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, a lot of things were shut down. And the city, of course, feels very different during the pandemic as well, because not as many people are going to work. So the downtown area is quite quiet, but I think we're starting to feel a sense of optimism as vaccines are rolling out, and our first responders and teachers and the elderly are starting to be vaccinated, which means that the rest of us can get shots soon and hopefully start to return to normal life, maybe around the summertime. So I think hopefully things are going to be taking a better turn soon.
Yeah, I think that we have the same hope here in Poland and in Europe. So now maybe let's get down to today's business. Despite sexism is still permeating all too many spheres of our lives, little is said about this phenomenon in the context of online activities aimed at top political figures. You, Nina, were leading a group of researchers to look at gendered and sexual disinformation against 13 high-level, well-known politicians like Vice President Kamala Harris or Prime Minister of New Zealand Jacinda Ardern. And you came up with an inspiring report, Malign Creativity, How Gender, Sex and Lies Are Weaponized Against Women Online. So first, could I ask you to dismantle this title of the report itself? What do you mean by malign creativity in the context of gender disinformation?
Absolutely. So we often use the term malign actor in English to talk about not film actors, but malign individuals or organizations on the internet who are using disinformation or influence operations in order to achieve some sort of political effect or influence the conversation. And what we see when we're looking at gendered and sexualized disinformation online, especially as it's targeted toward women, is a special sort of malign or malicious creativity. It makes it really difficult to track all of the memes, all of the slogans, all of the detrimental nicknames that people come up with for women in public life, because they shift almost imperceptibly across the internet. It might be a slightly different image, it might be a slightly different nickname, but you have to be in the know to kind of track these things. And that, based on our research, is what we've identified as the largest challenge to really cracking down on gendered and sexualized disinformation against women online. Social media platforms have a hard time keeping up with this malign creativity. And as a result, they're unable to really rein it in to make sure that these false narratives that are based on sex and gender don't overtake someone's online persona, don't abuse women, don't harass women. And that's why we call the report Malign Creativity.
And what are the main malign narratives against these high-level women?
So we identified three categories of narratives across basically all of the candidates that we identified, that we followed over a 2-month period in the end of 2020. And these are women who are from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. They represent different political parties. And as you mentioned, they also are on different continents. So we had 10 US politicians, Priti Patel, who's the Home Secretary in the United Kingdom, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and then Krista Freeland, who is the Vice Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister in Canada. And what we found is that they're often targeted by sexualized, racist, or transphobic narratives. So I'll give you an example of each of them. Sexualized narratives often target women's sexuality or their alleged promiscuity in order to say that they are not fit for office. So what we saw with Vice President Kamala Harris, for instance, was a pervasive narrative. 78% of the data that we found was targeted at Vice President Harris. This pervasive narrative that she ended up in the position that she's in because she slept her way to the top, because she had an affair early on in her career, and that she was willing to go to sexual lengths in order to maintain power. And this was something that followed many, many of the candidates that we tracked around the internet. We also saw racist narratives. They were primarily targeting the women of color in our sample. So not only targeting Vice President Harris, but targeting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for instance, or Ilhan Omar, the representative from Minnesota who's of Somali descent. And these narratives often paired with the sexualized narratives and said things like, Ilhan Omar married her brother in order to get American citizenship, which is not true. And that she should not be allowed to serve in Congress and she should go back to where she came from. We also saw a pervasive transphobic narrative that claimed that many of these women could not have gotten to the positions of power that they are in without having been men first. So they say that they are secretly men, that they are transgender individuals, and they are
That's
hiding.
getting QAnon sounding.
Yes, yes. And in fact, we did see some overlap with QAnon groups and purveyors of the QAnon conspiracy theory with these transphobic narratives. But those targeted Jacinda Ardern, they targeted Kamala Harris, and several other of our targets, our subjects as well. And this is a classic trope that's particularly pervasive against women of color. Many people who criticized Michelle Obama said the same thing. And it's often presented with visual evidence, where a photoshopped image is presented that makes it seem like these women have more male presenting features than female presenting features. And it's something, again, across the board, we found these narratives to be fairly pervasive. All of these types of narratives targeted 9 out of our 13 subjects of our research, and the sexualized narratives were the most prevalent among the 3.
You said that these activities are really difficult to track, but still, who is behind the abusive online activities?
So it's very difficult to identify the perpetrators in some cases, because many of these communities that we tracked, for instance, Twitter, or some of the alternative media platforms like Reddit or Gab, Parler, 4chan, 8chan, these are places where people don't have to use their real identities in order to create an account. So they're just individual citizens very frequently. And that's what's perhaps most unsettling about this idea. It's that it is so pervasive, and that people on the internet are very happy to attack women for being in public life and attack them on a gendered or sexualized basis in a way that men simply are not attacked. So we see that sort of behavior. We also do see malign state actors using gendered tropes and narratives against women in public life. And that's actually where this research came from. I had been doing some interviews in Ukraine and in Georgia, and kept coming across instances of women who were either activists, journalists, members of parliament, and who had been targeted by the Russian Federation with gendered and sexualized narratives. And so I coined this term sexualized disinformation, which led to a lot of other research. And I decided to investigate it a little bit more in my own country's political context this year. And it's also something that China and Iran use. And I think this is an important point. We often think about, disinformation as being something that's just fake. But actually, what I like to remind people is that it plays on the fissures in our societies, and it plays on real feelings and grievances that people have. And I don't think there's a country in the world that could say that really women have equal representation and are treated the same as men. And our adversaries recognize that, and recognize that by undermining women's participation in public life, they're able to really pull at the fabric of our democracy and further polarize us. And so this isn't only an issue about women's rights. It's not only an issue about democratic representation. It also becomes a national security issue when malign foreign actors are involved.
You mentioned Russia and China that are generally active in the field of disinformation. And now we hear that they are also very much effective in terms of spreading the gendered fake news and hate speech. And have you seen any of those concerning the European Union? Because we have here Ursula von der Leyen, the female head of European Commission. We have Angela Merkel, probably still the strongest leader in Europe. Russia and China often wish to present the West as weak. I am then wondering if they also point at women in power in Europe as proof of this argument of weakness.
Yes, I think so. So in our research, we didn't look at any contexts that weren't in the English language, but I will be doing some further research in Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish to look at gendered tropes used by Russian state-sponsored media in those contexts. But absolutely, I've seen articles on RT and Sputnik, the state-run propaganda outlets that are funded and run by Russia, where any woman in power, from Angela Merkel to Hillary Clinton, are described using gendered tropes, using language that portrays them as duplicitous or as not fit for office because of their quote unquote emotional nature. And I think that this is something that Russia is practiced at and frankly has used in its own domestic context as well. So certainly I think we'll start to see more of that. I'm hoping that people will start to call it out more. And I think it's clearly something that any foreign adversary, Russia, China, Iran, or anyone else who seeks to undermine Europe or the West writ large, can use in their disinformation playbook, which is why it's all the more important we draw attention to this inequity online.
I would like to ask you about us citizens, because it's understandable that disinformation is bad for the democratic process, as it makes us believe in lies that influence our choices at the ballot box. But why is the gendered and sexual disinformation important?
Well, this is really the core question that I think a lot of people don't realize the downstream effects of gendered and sexualized disinformation. When we look at someone like Kamala Harris, who is now the first female vice president here in the United States, she's broken the highest glass ceiling that women have broken here in this country. And what she had to endure to get there, attacks on her gender, attacks on her sexuality, all of these lies that she had to overcome. Yes, we may have broken that highest and hardest glass ceiling, but when women look at her, women of all stripes, women who are young, who are old, who are thinking about getting more involved in the public conversation, not necessarily even talking about politics, just expressing their opinions online. They see what someone like her, someone who has achieved so much, has had to endure. They think twice about whether they want to get involved in that conversation at all, let alone run for public office. I mean, we have pretty abysmal figures here in the United States about our representation of women in politics. And this sort of abuse really makes women reconsider their involvement in public life writ large, whether we're talking about politics, whether we're talking about journalism, academia, or anything else that requires women to be out front. And increasingly, we all need to be online because of our jobs, right? Especially during the pandemic. It's incumbent on you to put yourself out there and to network and to get your work known. And just for existing, just for participating in the public conversation, women often receive that sort of flack. So the example that's set at a very high level for someone who has achieved so much, to see what she has endured really can make women be a little bit more circumspect about their decision to be involved in the first place. And we need to do the opposite of that. We need to encourage women, in particular women of color who face compounded abuse, to get involved in the public sphere because our democracy is that much richer for it.
And more general, not only in terms of encouraging women to still fight their way up. What are the potential ways to counter the gendered abuse and disinformation, and what are your policy recommendations?
So we have a lot of policy recommendations in the report because this is an area that has unfortunately been really underexplored and paid too little attention to by social media platforms, lawmakers, and even employers. But the main recommendations are this. First, we really need social media platforms to start investing in a structure for reporting that puts less onus on the victims of abuse and that is more proactive on their side. So they need to be doing the same intelligence analysis, the same trend analysis that they do for foreign disinformation when we're talking about disinformation that is targeting half of society online. That's the first thing. The second thing is changing reporting structures online so that women who do report the abuse that they're experiencing are listened to, so that they understand where their reports are going and so that they can present a more detailed picture of what's happening to them. Often on platforms right now, what you have to do is just report by individual piece of content. So you might get a tweet that says, you deserve to be raped or something like that, and you'll report it. And generally, unfortunately, most of the things that we report and that our focus group participants reported came back to them and said, this was not a violation of our terms. We're sorry, you can report or block this person if you want to. What we'd like to see is a more holistic view, because often these are parts of larger campaigns against a target. So we'd like to be able to have women create incident reports so they can say, okay, this influencer started what we call this dog pile against me. They incited all of this bad content my way. Take a look at this. Here's a couple examples of the tweets, and that they can amend them and add to them over time. And then using the terms that are in that report, the platforms can then update their keywords, which govern their artificial intelligence. So the things that they use when computers are trying to do the work for humans and identify potentially bad language or harmful language that goes against their terms of service. All of this behavior, by the way, should be going against their terms of service. They're just not really taking the initiative to track that malign creativity across the internet. So that's a big set of recommendations for platforms. We also argue, and obviously our audience is mostly here in the United States, but for lawmakers, to not use this language in the halls of Congress or parliaments around the world, because they're setting an example, an important example for the citizens of their countries and beyond. And B, to make some affordances in upcoming legislation to really stamp out this sort of behavior online, to require platforms to do something about it, to uphold their terms of service, and also equip law enforcement to deal with online threats that might have some offline consequences, because often we're talking about threats to women's safety as well. Mm-hmm. And then finally, looking at employers. This is kind of the first line of defense for many women. So women who are at academic institutions or working in newsrooms, they need the support of their organizations to pay for things like anti-doxing services, to raise awareness of the threats against them with social media platforms and other advocacy organizations. And frankly, to provide the moral support that women need, because this has a psychological toll on you when you're going through it, so that they feel safe in continuing to do the work that is necessary and express their opinions online.
That's indeed a broad array of recommendations. Thank you for them. And now let's look a little bit more generally on disinformation that you're an expert on. You analyzed now for the report politicians as targets of disinformation. Now let's look a little bit more at politicians as creators and super spreaders of disinformation. So disinformation campaigns are on the rise, according to January report by the Oxford Internet Institute, but not only by them. But according to the Institute, organized disinformation campaigns were waged in 81 countries in 2020, up from 28 3 years ago. Such propaganda has become essential to many governments and political parties' campaigning efforts and is used to discredit opponents. So how can we fight disinformation when even the ruling elites are not on our side?
That is the question of the moment, I think. And we're just coming out of 4 years of having dealt with that in the United States. And I know In Poland, there's a similar situation going on that I write about in my book, where in Poland, in Georgia, in the United States, and other countries around the world, Brazil, the Philippines, there's a strong desire to fight foreign disinformation. But when it comes to domestic disinformation, we kind of throw up our hands and say, well, that's just politics. But it cannot be politics. Disinformation knows no political party. It is a threat to our democracy. If we don't have a shared understanding of the truth and the facts by which people go out and engage with the democratic system, then democracy can't work. Democracy can't work without that shared information, without trust in the system. And that's often, if you look at the disinformation campaign that Donald Trump ran, it is meant to undermine our democratic systems and the infrastructure of our democracy. So what I'm encouraging members of Congress to do, and frankly, any other foreign government officials that I meet with, I used to meet with them more, now it's all over Zoom, but really encouraging them to stand by the principles of democracy and stand by the principles of truth, because we need that cascading effect from our officials on down, so that we're not normalizing disinformation, that we are outlawing it. Because it, as we've seen, it has an effect on democracy. It has an effect on public safety and public health. That has been laid out for us in the starkest terms over 2020 and the beginning of 2021 here in the United States with the events at the Capitol. So setting that example is extraordinarily important. We need our governments to also be focused on fighting foreign disinformation, absolutely, but equipping citizens with the tools that they need, really investing in things like digital literacy and information literacy, critical thinking, civics, making sure that our citizens are equipped to navigate today's very chaotic information environment, which I don't think many Western democracies are doing a great job with that. We've seen some good examples from Sweden and Finland and Estonia, but we need the robust democracies like the United States, like Poland, to start to invest in those efforts as well on a really tangible level, not just little side programs or shunted off to civil society. It needs to be something that's integrated into the curriculum, targeted at civil servants and government employees as well. And there need to be standards for politicians who traffic in disinformation. They need to be censured. Voters need to get them out of office. It should not be something that we are tolerating. And the one way that I think that we can do that is, again, building awareness about the tools and tactics, and encouraging people to really to uphold the standards of truth at the ballot box.
But tell me how we are so susceptible at the same time to the outright conspiracy theories, and like on the example of QAnon. I read this interview with a Harvard educated woman who is well aware that many of these theories are lies, but still she's a follower. Why?
Yeah, I think we're in a unique psychological moment right now where people are feeling really isolated. Things are very confusing. We're pretty fearful also of the future or what's going to come next week even. And so people are searching for a comforting theory to kind of make sense of this difficult moment. And I think that's why it's important as individuals, if we have people who are buying into these theories in our lives, not to shut them out and to try to engage with them on a personal level, to understand why they're pursuing these things, and maybe very gently nudge them away from it, not outright fact checking them, but saying, okay, you're concerned about child trafficking, for instance, which is often kind of a tertiary issue with QAnon. Here are some real sources for, or you might not use that term, but here are some trustworthy sources about child trafficking and ways that you can help without being involved in this QAnon movement, which has caused, so many violent acts. I think there's a real psychological response and personal response that we need to understand about these movements. It's not only about education, there is an emotional part of it. And social media is partially to blame there as well. These algorithms that feed us content day in and day out, when we're sitting on these platforms at home, stuck at home during the coronavirus pandemic, they're feeding us the most engaging content. And the most engaging content is always emotional, and it's often enraging. It's usually stuff that really makes us mad, that we want to engage with, that we're going to share or interact with. And that's great for the platform because it keeps us on the platform longer. So we need to think about social media regulations as well, and whether or not the
Stop publishing engaging content.
yeah.
It will be
well,
tough.
Well, we're changing what engaging looks like, because right now the platforms are prioritizing that content, and they could be prioritizing content that, you know, was a little bit better for democracy rather than this conspiratorial content, and they know it's a problem, and they've refused over and over to put the interests of democracy over their business interests, and that's something that is clearly a job for regulation to solve.
So finally, the devil's advocate question. What do you think about closing accounts of country leaders and other spreaders of disinformation?
So, for many years, I have been advocating for the government officials who are on social media platforms to be held to the same standards as everyone else who uses those platforms. Because when we have inequitable enforcement of terms of service, it sends a mixed message to the users of those platforms that says, you know, if you're important enough and powerful enough, you can get away with breaking the rules, and the rules only exist for you if you're a little guy. And we do know, based on the data, that the people whose voices are often quashed on these platforms, the normal people, they're people from marginalized communities, people from communities of color. They're the ones who are truly being silenced and censored. And so when we see something like Donald Trump, you know, yes, he was president of the United States when his account was removed from Twitter and temporarily suspended from Facebook. But we were in a critical crisis situation at that point. It was a scary moment, not just to be here in Washington, but all around the country. And there were threats of more violence, credible threats, according to our law enforcement bodies. And many of the insurrectionists were pointing to Donald Trump and saying that his language actually encouraged them to show up and to breach the Capitol, and that they were, you know, happy to shed blood if that's what it meant to change the results of the election. And so I think that was an emergency measure that needed to be taken. And Donald Trump had been granted, you know, many free passes by the social media companies, but it also needs to be said over and over that social media platforms aren't free speech zones. They have rules, they are private platforms, and those rules they can enforce however they see fit. And that's the truth of it. And I also think there's something in between censorship and just free speech willy-nilly, no holds barred. There is a happy medium, and that is, you know, the enforcement of these terms of service. So it is unfortunate that the president, you know, lost his access to those platforms, but there need to be consequences for people's actions and for the lies that they're telling. And so I support those actions, and we'll see soon if Facebook decides to keep Donald Trump off its platform for good. But hopefully we'll continue to see equitable enforcement of terms of service for all government officials and world leaders, because no one can cry censorship then if, you know, a member of parliament is being held to the same standard as your crazy uncle who lives down the street. And that's something we should all aspire to.
Thank you, Nina, for all these great insights, and it was wonderful to talk to you as always.
Yes, thank you so much, Karolina. My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.